very much for inviting me here. I hope it's going to be useful to you. A journey has to start somewhere. If you're booking a train or a plane ticket online and you just put in your destination, the system immediately says, fill in both boxes, fill in where are you coming from. We often talk about learning as a journey, but we don't often treat our educational planning or policy making in the same way that we plan journeys. Teachers planning lessons, schools establishing their priorities, national education departments designing curricula for schools, all tend to ask the same question. They ask only for the destination of the educational journey, not where it's starting from. We tend not to ask, how much have they learned already, and how have they learned it? Instead, we often depend on theories that claim predictable stages in children's learning, like what 6-year-olds should know or be able to do. But what I'm going to talk about today starts from the argument that we set ourselves inevitable problems if we only think about the goals of children's learning and not about what they may have learned already. I'm not talking here about individual experiences and circumstances of each child, because I know that in Lithuania that's an important part of the system here. That's very good. And I'm not talking about ages and stages, approaches such as Piaget's, which propose phases of childhood and ideas of learning readiness that are supposed to be common to all children. It'll probably be clearer if I describe the experience that led to the research that I've been doing. In the years that I worked at the British Film Institute, I took part in training courses and other initiatives with hundreds of teachers across the UK, getting them to show films, usually non-mainstream short films, to their classes and to discuss them with the children. They were always a bit anxious about this, especially at the primary level. They weren't sure how the children would react to the unfamiliar material, and they weren't sure whether it was really the right thing to be doing. But always, absolutely without exception, they were amazed at the children's responses. And they were shocked at how radically this changed their assumptions about some children's abilities. Am I going too fast? Is it okay? All right? Good. So these are some of the things they said. So is it okay if I assume you can read the slides? I don't like reading PowerPoints. I'm sure you can all read. They made these kinds of comments. Always something like this would come up. And their immediate conclusion would be, oh, well, films are really good as a stimulus to help children to write, for example. And we had to struggle a little harder to convince them that it would be worth teaching about films in their own right, as they would do with any other art form. But the point of this story, in terms of what I'm talking about today, was that it made me wonder what the children had already learned about film and when they had learned it. Even 3-year-olds in nursery schools were surprising their teachers with a really intense and sustained interest in films that their teachers had thought were too challenging for them to deal with. So I was asking myself, when do children start learning how to make sense of moving image media? I'm going to use this term movies because it's just, I don't want to go on saying moving image media, it'll take me all day. Most people think we don't have to learn to watch films or television. The whole history of movies is full of claims about how accessible they are, how easy they are to understand. And one of the things that actually makes people anxious about the idea of allowing children to study film in school is this notion that movies are just transparent and easy to understand. People claim that movies are obvious because they're a visual medium, but they aren't just a visual medium, and they aren't instantly comprehensible if you've never seen a movie before. Have a look at this. I don't know if you can see it clearly enough. It's a guy on the phone to the police, and he's saying, yeah, I heard a scream, and I had a cry for help, and then there was some really ominous music. Well, okay, if you get the joke, you'll know what non-diegetic music is. It's music that's not part of the world of the film, the realistic world of the film. It's music that's added in order to give an emotional impact. We know that that doesn't happen in reality, and that's why the cartoon is maybe a bit amusing. Filmmakers know that we respond instantly and emotionally to music, and that it's effective, for example, in suspense. There are several visual features of movies that also relate to, in that way, to how we experience real life without actually mimicking it. For instance, if I suddenly look down like that, you'd probably be quite curious about what I'd seen. And if this was a movie, you'd expect to see then to see a shot of what it was on the floor that I saw. But then point of view shots in a movie aren't showing you what you would see, they're showing what I would see. So it's already a little bit different from real life experience. Parallel montage is even more unnatural. If a movie cuts rapidly between two actions, say somebody dangling over the edge of a cliff and someone else in a helicopter anxiously gazing down, we can easily put together a rescue narrative there. And when we see a jump cut between somebody getting out of a car and then the same person entering a room, we know that they got out of the car, they went into the building, they went up the stairs, but we don't need to be shown all that. We can put those together as a single action. These are all things, though, that we've learned, and we forget that we've learned them. To us, they just seem obvious. We learn to understand them when we were very young. Most children have opportunities to watch TV from when they're a few months old, and by the time they're 4, they can quite happily follow most of a feature film. But it's a mistake to dismiss that learning as too simple and too easy to bother about. Let's not forget that it's during those toddler years that children learn to speak human language. And that's not simple, that's an amazing achievement. So, although many movie conventions relate quite closely to evolved instinctive human behaviour, they're probably quite confusing to an 18-month-old baby. I say probably because it would be enormously difficult to test that in children who can't yet speak clearly, let alone explain some of these quite complex ideas. But within 12 to 18 months, a child will be able to follow quite a lot of those examples. And by the time a child is 4, she'll have a huge store of movie memories to help her enjoy fast-moving mainstream feature films that she'll be watching on DVD or maybe even in the cinema, and probably with family or older siblings. Because films like that are designed to appeal to a wide range of age groups. But it's not easy to gather data about that crucial period of learning. The language of children under 3 is often difficult for people to understand unless you're inside the family. And they don't readily sit in one place, and they quite often don't do what they're told. So it's not surprising that the most interesting studies of very young children have been done by their own parents or grandparents, like these 6 people, for instance. I've found that studies of 2-year-olds are considerably less common than studies of infants or of children in nursery or daycare settings, who are usually 3 or 4 years old. But the 3rd year of life is absolutely crucial in child development. It's when children learn to speak and to begin to strongly assert their own identities and preferences. And I believe this is also the period when children who have access to movies, regardless of what technologies they watch them on, that's when they learn how to understand the conventions and the devices that are used in movies to tell stories. But as far as I know, hardly anybody, maybe nobody else, has attempted to investigate this learning process. So what I'm going to do this morning is draw on my research and tell you about 3 of the things, there were a lot more, but 3 of the things I found when I studied a pair of non-identical twins, a boy and a girl from the age of 22 to 36 months. They are my own grandchildren, so I studied them in familiar contexts, in their home and in mine. While they watched TV programs and films, mainly on a TV set and occasionally on a desktop computer. In the period when I studied them, they didn't have access to any portable devices, so it was really talking about watching movies on bigger screens than a phone or an iPad. I used video to capture their behaviour, but I'm not going to show you any of the video material because you'll find it as boring as I did, and as hard to understand when I first watched it. You have to really know the children, you have to watch it over and over again. So I'm going to rely on still images to show you some of the features of what I discovered. The first thing I want to tell you about is focused attention. So here's an example. Here we can see Connie and Alfie. They're 2 years and 4 months here. They're watching a short film called Anima 2, and they're watching it for the first time. They walked across the room and came up to the set and watched it close up. Anima 2 is a non-mainstream animated film. It's not made for children, but it was for people attending the Anima 2 festival that takes place in Switzerland each year. And the film uses this classic trope of a cat chasing a mouse. It's quite playful, to illustrate different techniques such as drawn animation, 3D model animation, computer animation, and so on. There isn't really a story, there's just repeated actions. It's quite fun. Now I've highlighted 2 things in this image which you might well not have noticed first. Alfie's frowning, I don't know if you can see that. It can be hard to see when a 2-year-old is frowning because their faces are so plump and their eyebrows are so faintly defined. And this isn't a frown of anger or fear, it's a frown of concentration. And they're both gripping the edge of the TV trolley. It's something they often did when they wanted to watch something and maintain a fixed gaze. It's hard for a 2-year-old to maintain themselves completely still because their centre of gravity is higher than ours. So they'd always be, I call it bracing, holding onto something and keeping themselves steady. Something else you can easily see is they both have their mouths open. They're breathing quite deeply as they concentrate, and they leave their mouths open to do this, because like many 2-year-olds, they often have runny noses. And you can see that they're standing very close to the big flat screen TV set. Lots of parents tell children they shouldn't stand close to the screen because it's bad for your eyes. But actually, if you ever try getting close to a big flat screen TV, get really close to it, you'll find it's an amazing experience. The images are still recognisable because they're made up of so many really tiny pixels. And the screen exceeds one's field of vision, so you have to look around to keep track of things. In other words, it's kind of more lifelike because you have to choose what to look at. So over the first few months of my research, I watched the twins fight and win what I call the battle for proximity, when they were absolutely determined to stand or sit very close to the screen, and often to touch it as well. And in one case, to lick it. But anyway, I've noted 16 notable and recurrent features of attention as the research progressed. Bracing I've mentioned already, and the frowning, and chewing the cheek. It's very difficult to see, but again, it's when you're tense, maybe some of you do that. I do it as well, like that. Gripping something with a hand. Hand stationing is when your hand lies palm down. It would leave the hand lying on the table like that. Hand collection is when your hand sort of lies on its back like that, with the fingers lightly flexed. And hands tucked is when the hand is closed and knuckles pressed downwards, as in these 2 images. So you can see they're tucking their hands down by their sides and keeping themselves steady and concentrated. Let's go back to that one. So in all these cases, these were expressions or positions that were maintained for a long time, sometimes as long as 7 minutes, which is a long time for a toddler. And often after a change of position, such as wiping their nose or relaxing their shoulders for a moment, they'd get back to the previous attentive position. Intense concentration like this was characteristic of their encounters with anything new. Even, as the mother explains here, I'll show you, they didn't always commit to it. In case people are on headphones. Can you read this? Or shall I read it to you? Got it. Okay. So basically the point is that they had this tremendous attention and that they would give everything a chance. They wouldn't just sort of say, no, I don't like this. They would concentrate on it and make an informed decision about where to go on watching. But when they were interested, one or both of them was interested in the movie on their first viewing, they would immediately demand to see it again. And repeat viewing is an enormously important part of toddlers' movie watching. It's widely commented on in social media how toddlers will watch something over and over again. But not much thought is given to why they do this. It's more than simply liking something, it's making a commitment to studying it over an extended period. And when they stop watching it, I think we should resist condescending comments such as, oh, he got bored with it, or I prefer to say, he's used it up, or he's got all he can out of it. The child has reached the point where he feels that he really knows the movie and understands it enough. What this should remind us of is the intense multimodal complexity of movies. Okay, what's this one going to do? That's all right, okay. I've lost my place now. Yeah, it should remind us how intensely multimodal movies are. They're very, very complex, and it rewards that level of commitment. You get a lot from reviewing. So focused attention wasn't simply serving the purpose of figuring out what was going on. It was helping them make judgments about whether they want to watch it or not. And they did watch Anima 2 more than 20 times over the following 7 months. It was the movie they most wanted to see over and over again. And they became more and more adept at pointing things out and commenting on what was happening. That was an unusually long period of engagement with a single film. More commonly, they'd watch something for a week or two, maybe longer, and then move on to something else. And it's interesting, I think, that this extended commitment to Anima 2 happened with a non-mainstream movie. It seems that it offered them more to study and figure out. But even with mainstream movies, it's noticeable that they often chose material that was right at the edge of their ability to understand. It offered them interpretive challenges that were neither too easy or too hard, but worth working on. Some experimental research on 2-year-olds' television watching behaviour claims that children of this age aren't very attentive to what they watch, and they frequently break off to do something else. I think that tells us more about experimental methods than it tells us about 2-year-olds. I think 2-year-olds in the laboratory are likely to run around and look at things. We get more reliable evidence from parents themselves, as shown on social media. Here are some typical comments. But as you see, they tend to fall into one or other of 2 categories. It's all about loving stuff, it's a favourite, then you got bored, or it's more sort of medicalised language, addiction, being mesmerised. And I think these comments do reveal underlying assumptions that aren't based on objective observation. The use of affective terms indicates a family culture that values and enjoys movies. Adopting medicalised language betrays anxieties about the effects of movies on young minds. Both sets of attitudes are locked into what I call the risk-benefit paradigm, which is something I'll come back to later. And now, what I want to point out is that neither of these forms of language reflects what I observed in my research, even though I'm certain that I'm referring to the same phenomena as these parents. What I saw was deliberate, careful attentiveness, the same kind of attentiveness that you or I would display if we were concentrating on a complicated but fascinating poem or a difficult mathematical problem. What we see in this kind of attentiveness is a child hard at work, not a victim of hypnosis. And I'm not claiming there's anything unusual about my grandchildren. I think they're pretty average. And it's important to stress that the children chose when to be attentive like this. It certainly didn't happen all the time. In English, we talk about things catching our attention, which implies that attention is an intellectual activity that somehow just gets switched on directly by the stimulus. In education, we worry a lot about children's attentiveness, how to catch it, how to maintain it. We devise strategies to keep them attentive and entice them into more difficult tasks with amusing or intriguing starting points. I spent a long time during my research feeling sure that the attentive behaviour I was observing was very significant, but I couldn't move beyond that into figuring out why they were investing so much effort in apparently trying to make sense of movies that were often clearly quite challenging to them. It was when I started reading work in embodied cognition that I started to see a different way of approaching this. Not many scholars in the UK have taken this up yet. I'd be interested to know if you are aware of it. But in case you are unfamiliar, I'll just give you a bit of background. Cartesian philosophy has dominated Western thinking for 300 years. It encourages to see a separation between mind and body, and to believe that we must control our passions and prioritise rational thought over emotions. Embodied cognition makes a decisive break with the idea of mind and body as separate. And these are 4 of the books that helped me to understand the different approach that embodied cognition that scholars are arguing for. Well, obviously, I'm not going to summarise them all. I'll just pull out some key points. Gibson overturns some long-held assumptions about visual perception, and he shows how closely it's tied into all our other physical perceptions, such as balance, gravity, how we negotiate our physical environment. Damasio directly challenges Descartes from a neuroscientific perspective and shows how reasoning is tied into our emotions. Lakoff and Johnson explain how all our abstract thought is only made possible by metaphors that are based in our physical experience of the world, such as high, low, near and far, movement through space, and so on. Panksepp follows Damasio's focus on the emotions, and he shows how these have developed through human evolution. He describes the various emotional operating systems in the brain that we share with all mammals and enable us from birth to start learning and to survive. They're really crucial. They're not sort of an extra thing, and they're not primitive either. He focuses on the earliest evolutionary phases of human existence to identify 4 emotions that relate to basic environmental challenges: fear, panic, rage, and seeking. Now, it's the concept of seeking that I got very interested in. Here's what Panksepp says about it. He says it's essential to feelings of engagement and excitement. It generates anticipation and investigation. It gradually helps cement the perception of causal connections in the world, and thereby creates ideas. It's really crucial to thought. You can see why fear, panic and rage would be important in early humans trying to stay alive in a dangerous environment. But seeking was also important for survival. It's not only for things like foraging and hunting, but also for figuring things out and making plans. So Panksepp's not talking about emotion in the old-fashioned sense of overwhelming sentiment, but as feelings we're hardly aware of, that are still an essential part of our thinking processes. This got me looking in a new way at the twins' attentive behaviour, and to look more closely for signs of other emotions such as apprehension or sadness, and how these also tied in with their growing awareness of movie narrative. So this is the second area of my research I want to tell you about. A number of scholars now agree that our emotional engagement with movies doesn't just consist of getting excited about a chase or crying at the sad bits, but that emotion in a much broader and more fundamental sense, as Panksepp describes it, is essential to the comprehension of narrative. Here's a couple of quotations that I think are useful here. If understanding of the self and perception of social episodes involve a central role for affect, it seems likely that affect also plays a significant part in response to narrative. And then there's Ward much later saying cinema is not primarily narrative, but affective. Indeed, it's unlikely one may have a meaningful narrative experience without it already also being an emotional one. It's quite a big claim, but I think an interesting one. Around the same time as Mion was writing his paper, a group of scholars at the University of Parma in Italy were starting to publish their research on what they call mirror neurons in macaque monkeys. These are neurons that fire both when a monkey performs a particular action, but also when it sees another monkey performing an action. And this has generated a lot of interest, especially when research later on indicated that this probably exists in humans as well. It's argued that mirror neurons confer evolutionary advantage by enabling animals to detect the intentions of others in their species, and they may form the basis of humans' ability to empathise with other people. So again, it's really important in our development as humans. Gallese, who was one of the Parma scholars, proposes the concept of embodied simulation to characterise the ways in which humans interpret and assess others' behaviour. This potentially casts new light on the way in which all humans tend to mimic other people's expressions and gestures. You must have had that experience in parties when you're talking to someone you find you're both posed in the same position. It happens unconsciously, and it can be a way of it being interpreted as a way of trying out the feelings that the bodily phenomena are expressing, and it can relate to characters on screen as well as to real people. So it may be a significant element of children's learning to follow narrative when they recognise, relate to, and imitate expressions and gestures and postures of characters in movies. It's particularly relevant in the study of 2-year-olds, given that their linguistic fluency and ability to follow narratives are still developing. I sometimes observe the children engaging in embodied simulation, particularly when a gesture or a movement made by a character on screen intrigued one of them. And here's an example. The children are just over 2 years old. Connie's just seen a character on screen who's she's clasping her hands like this, pleading with her father, saying, "Please get the moon for me, Father." And Connie puts her hands together like that to try and imitate it. Okay? And her mother, Phoebe, notices this and she says, "Is that how she does it, Connie?" And as Connie turns to her, Phoebe laces her fingers like that and says, "She says, 'Please get the moon for me,' doesn't she?" So she's kind of reinforcing Connie's understanding of the movie. But Connie opens her hands and looks at her and goes, "What?" She can't do it, but she really wants to do it. And she's interested, I think, to discover that the gesture is intrinsically linked to feeding. In other words, the movie is teaching her not only language, but also gesture, and how both can express emotion. This exchange between Phoebe and Connie also leads me on to the third area that I want to discuss, which is the social context of children's viewing. They did watch the television on their own at home sometimes when Phoebe was cooking or doing a household task, but most of their movie watching was done with other people. This scenario, adults watching movies with very young children, is extremely common, and it can clearly be an important part of the learning that toddlers are constantly doing in their every waking moment. But it's not necessarily the adults explaining the movie to them. In fact, that hardly ever happens, I think. So some of the time, the adults may be exchanging comments that go right over the children's heads. Here, we were all watching the Step in Time sequence from the movie Mary Poppins. The children are 2 years and 5 months old, and it's the second time they've seen it. The adults are exchanging remarks and giggling at the excesses of the scene. We found it really funny. Connie was fully engaged in trying to follow this incredibly fast-moving scene. The laughter adds another dimension to the soundtrack, our laughter. She's thinking, well, what are they laughing at? What's so funny here? And this is an example, I think, of the way adults model behaviour for children. I don't mean anything so literal as saying, you've got to laugh at Dick Van Dyke and the chimney sweeps. I'm suggesting a more general sense in which adults and older siblings as well model a general relationship to the screen. These adults may be laughing, but they are sitting down and they're looking at the screen, and Connie is on Phoebe's lap. In this family, movies are important. We watch them attentively and make comments about what we see. So in other situations where the children are watching something that they do know and understand, they excitedly join in by naming and pointing to characters, and before long also anticipating actions and events in well-known stories. So here's Alfie, tremendously excited as he emphatically points. He's actually raised his shoulders, pointing like that at the egg at the beginning of The Very Hungry Caterpillar. So of course this is fun for everyone. The children's excited involvement gains adult amusement and approval. In repeat viewings, anticipating the next shot or character entry becomes a ritual that everyone enjoys. But the adults also join in. In viewing my videos, I was astonished at how many little utterances the adult co-viewers would be making. Wow, oh dear, that kind of thing. And it wasn't very conscious behaviour, I know because I was doing it too. It was just part of the ongoing instinctive sort of running commentary that adults do most of the time with toddlers. But again, here, they're modelling a relationship with the screen, encouraging attentiveness and engagement, establishing movie watching as a pleasurable shared event, without thinking about it. They just do it. And of course this varies between families. Some may be anxious about their children's movie watching and curtail it severely. Others may have the TV on the whole time and treat it as background noise. Toddlers with one or more older siblings may be watching a lot of material that's aimed at older age groups. However, I don't think many toddlers are the hapless victims of other people's viewing habits. They will pay attention to what intrigues them and what they think will reward some effort to understand it. And they will largely ignore movies that don't attract them. They will also reject and avoid movies that upset or frighten them. Clearly, they may, in some cases, become intrigued by material that's unsuitable for them, but I believe this risk is probably exaggerated. The predominant agenda for research and policy making in children and media is starkly different from that on, say, mother tongue teaching or marketing learning, rather, or the development of mathematical skills. It's framed in very simple terms, being concerned predominantly with risks, with a few nods in the direction of benefits. So, I'm sure you're familiar with these. They might be watching unsuitable material, they might be misled, they might be traumatised by it. They're wasting time that could be better spent on something more improving and suitable. They become aggressive and hyperactive, or they become obese and passive. We're not quite sure which, maybe both. And then maybe there are some benefits. You know, they learn language, they discover things about the world, they develop skills that are useful, and they enjoy it. Could be good. And media literacy policies, at least the ones I'm aware of, are now almost entirely focused on digital media, underpinned by anxieties about the revolution in access that digital technologies present. I'm not saying that's not important, but we do have, I think, this sort of feverish atmosphere about children and digital media, where policymakers have lost sight of the immense variety of content that these media provide, and they're ignoring how important it is to recognise the specificities of each type of content. Movies are one significant category of digital content. Feature films, television, home videos, film advertisements, they're distinctive, they're a distinctive medium, and they're important. There are overlaps as well between movies and games. But I think the interesting thing about moving images within computer games is how they've developed over the years, and how the more they resemble the classic conventions of movies, the more satisfying and successful they are. Movies have a 120-year-old history, and they've established, you could call it a gold standard in narrative form that combines movement, duration, graphics, colour, music, sound effects. Those are just a few of the elements that comprise this really complex medium. They're valued. We value them. They're valued as economically successful industries and expressions of national culture. They can be watched on giant screens by hundreds of people and by individuals on tiny portable screens. They provide a common currency for conversations and for cultural cross-referencing in families, in social groups and in huge online communities. It's really very strange that we don't study these things in school. I'll summarise now then the main points that I've made about toddlers' viewing practices. There's an awful lot of my research I haven't had time to deal with today. For example, the ways in which children's understanding of narrative structure developed over time, how they began to make judgments about the truth or reality of what they were watching, how they dealt with powerful emotional responses such as fear and sadness, and how they came to terms with the very sad fact that movies have to end. Alfie in particular found that very, very hard. So I've dealt with three topics: the phenomena of focused attention, their emotional engagement with movies, and how the social context of movie watching contributed to their learning. And I mean learning about movies. I hope these have given you a taste of what we lose if we ignore these early experiences. I think we have a lot to learn from the astonishing achievements that occur in the third year of life, many of them self-driven and relatively unmediated. So I want to end up with these four sort of arguments for a movie curriculum. The children come into school having already studied film for a long time. They invest a huge amount of energy in paying attention to movies and learning to understand them. They're selective about their movie watching, and it looks like they're particularly interested in things that are right at the edge of their ability to understand them. And this learning underpins their later development as learning and as cultural participants. As the teachers' responses showed, it completely transformed the way they looked at the children that they taught. I think schools could build on this learning by recognising it, respecting it, and by giving children opportunities to continue developing their knowledge of this important cultural form. Toddlers have by no means learned everything by the time they're 3 or 4. There's a lot more to do. I think we should get out of the habit of ignoring toddlers' viewing habits or making assumptions about them. Instead of thinking about the effects movies may have on toddlers, we should respect their investment of energy in making sense of movies. We need to be aware that at only 2 years old, toddlers can make decisive choices about what they do and don't want to watch. We should respect their motivations in doing this and try to understand them. As I described in the beginning about my experiences with teachers, we already know that giving 5 and 6-year-olds the chance to study and talk about movies can enable a big leap forward in confidence and articulacy. If this was fine art or music I've been talking about, no one would object to bringing examples of these art forms into schools. So why aren't we bringing movies into school to build on children's early experiences with this art form and to introduce them to movies that they might not otherwise see? That's my presentation. Thank you for listening, and thanks very much to the interpreters.